November 12th, 2023. A Sunday morning in Portland, Oregon. Families gathered at Grace Community Church, children's voices rising in hymn. Then, at exactly 10:17 a.m., gunfire shattered the sanctuary. Two children, 8-year-old Allara and 6-year-old Thaddeus Whitmore, collapsed in the third row as their mother watched in horror. The gunman? 28-year-old Gideon Collins, who walked out as calmly as he'd entered. But what investigators discovered in the weeks that followed revealed something far more twisted than a random act of violence. A father-son conspiracy, a manifesto justifying child murder, and a DNA revelation so shocking it would transform everything we thought we knew about this case. This is the story of how religious extremism, family secrets, and calculated evil converged in one of the most disturbing trials in recent American history. If you're interested in deep dives into criminal psychology and the legal battles that define justice, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Cases like this one require us to understand not just what happened, but why, and how the system responds. Drop a comment below with your thoughts as we go through this, and let's get into what really happened that morning in Portland. The morning of November 12th, 2023, began like any other Sunday in Portland's Alameda neighborhood. The air was crisp, carrying that distinctive Pacific Northwest chill that makes you pull your jacket a little tighter. Families were making their way to Grace Community Church, a progressive congregation known for its welcoming stance on LGBTQ issues and its commitment to social justice. Parents herded children through the parking lot, clutching coffee cups and diaper bags. Inside, the sanctuary was filling up with the familiar hum of morning greetings, rustling programs, and the soft, warming notes of the organ. The stained glass windows filtered autumn sunlight into kaleidoscopes of color across the wooden pews. It was peaceful, sacred, even. Nobody could have imagined that in less than an hour, this sanctuary would become a crime scene, and two children would be dead on the floor where they'd come to worship. By 10:15 a.m., Reverend Michael Chun, the youth minister, was preparing to lead the congregation in the opening hymn. The Whitmore family sat in their usual spot, the third row, right side. Cormac and Serafina Whitmore flanked their two children. 8-year-old Allara, with her gap-toothed smile and a worn stuffed rabbit she'd had since she was 3, and 6-year-old Thaddeus, whose mop of dark curls bounced as he fidgeted in his seat, whispering questions about why the windows had so many colors and whether dinosaurs could really come back like in the movies. Serafina gently shushed him, smoothing his hair with that automatic maternal gesture parents make 1,000 times without thinking. Cormac had his arm around Allara, who was tracing patterns on the hymnal in front of her. It was an ordinary moment of family intimacy, the kind that happens in churches across America every Sunday. Mundane, beautiful, fleeting. At exactly 10:17 a.m., as the congregation rose for the opening hymn, the crack of gunfire exploded through the sanctuary. The sound was so foreign, so utterly wrong in that space, that several people would later report thinking something had fallen from the balcony. A hymnal, maybe, or a piece of equipment. Our brains struggle to process the impossible, especially when the impossible is violence in a place designed for peace. But there was no mistaking the second shot. Or the third. Allara Whitmore crumpled instantly, the bullet entering her chest and severing her aorta before her young mind could even register what was happening. Her stuffed rabbit fell from her hands. Thaddeus turned toward his sister's falling body, his mouth opening in what should have been a scream, but the sound never fully formed. The second shot struck him in the back of the head, and his small frame collapsed across his mother's lap, blood already beginning to pool on the century-old floorboards that had witnessed baptisms, weddings, and funerals, but never murder. Serafina's screams were immediate and primal, the sound of a mother's soul being torn in half. It's a sound that every first responder who arrived that day would describe as the worst thing they'd ever heard, worse than any car crash or fire scene. It was pure, distilled anguish, the kind that carries through walls and into the bones of anyone who hears it. Cormac was on his knees instantly, his hands pressing against wounds that were already beyond any earthly intervention, his voice breaking as he begged his children to stay with him, to hold on, to not leave. But they were already gone. In the span of perhaps 5 seconds, the Whitmore family had been destroyed. The sanctuary erupted into chaos, people screaming, running, diving under pews, pulling children to the ground, trying to make sense of something that made no sense at all. And in the back of the church, 28-year-old Gideon Collins lowered his weapon with an expression witnesses would later describe as eerily calm, almost serene, like someone who'd just completed a routine task on a grocery list. He didn't run. He didn't panic. He simply turned and walked toward the exit, stepping over purses and Bibles that had clattered to the floor as people stampeded toward the side doors. His face was blank, emotionless, as if he'd just delivered a package rather than ended two young lives. Several congregants would later recall seeing him in the back corner before the shooting started, his lips moving silently, as if praying in a language only he could hear. Now those same people were scrambling over each other to get away from him, to shield their own children, to escape a nightmare that had materialized without warning in the middle of a Sunday service. Reverend Chun, who had been leading the hymn when the shooting started, threw himself over 3 children in the front row, his body becoming a human shield. He'd feel the heat of the gunpowder, hear the ringing in his ears that wouldn't stop for days, but the kids beneath him would survive. It was instinct, training, faith, whatever you want to call that split-second decision to put your body between bullets and children. Within 90 seconds of the first shot, Collins had vanished into the tree-lined streets of Portland's Alameda neighborhood, leaving behind a scene that would haunt every person present for the rest of their lives. 2 small bodies. A mother covered in her children's blood. A father trying to do CPR on wounds that couldn't be fixed. And a congregation of people who'd come to worship and instead witnessed evil in its purest form. The first Portland Police Bureau units arrived at 10:21 a.m., their sirens adding to the cacophony of car alarms that had been triggered by the gunshots and the wailing of survivors who'd made it outside. Officer Sarah Brennan was first through the doors, her service weapon drawn, her training overriding the visceral shock of what she was seeing. Blood splattered across a painting of Jesus blessing children that hung near the altar, hymnals scattered like fallen leaves. And in the third row, 2 children who were clearly beyond help. Brennan immediately began triaging the wounded, a woman with a broken ankle from the stampede, an elderly man in shock, a teenager with glass embedded in his shoulder from a blown-out window. Her partner, Officer Tim Rodriguez, secured the scene and confirmed what everyone already knew. The shooter was gone. They were dealing with the aftermath now, and that aftermath was going to require every resource the Portland Police Department had. Detective Marcus Kelly arrived at 10:24 a.m., still holding the coffee he'd been grabbing 3 blocks away when the call came through. He was a 15-year veteran who'd worked homicides, gang shootings, domestic violence calls that ended in bloodshed. He'd seen bodies in alleys, in cars, in homes where families had been torn apart by violence. But nothing had prepared him for the sight of 2 children murdered in a house of God, their parents cradling their bodies and keening with a grief that seemed to make the very air vibrate with anguish. Kelly stepped outside and vomited behind a rhododendron bush, his hands shaking, his mind trying to compartmentalize something that couldn't be compartmentalized. Then he forced himself back inside, steadied his hands despite the nausea still churning in his gut, and began the methodical work of turning a crime scene into a prosecutable case. The sanctuary had to be sealed immediately. Kelly called for the medical examiner and the crime scene investigation unit, knowing that every minute counted in preserving evidence. He began the agonizing process of separating witnesses for individual interviews before their memories could contaminate each other, a necessary evil in any investigation, but particularly cruel here, where people were still in shock and desperately needed the comfort of being together. Reverend Chun, still shaking, provided the first coherent account. A young white male, late 20s, brown hair, wearing a dark jacket and jeans, had entered during the opening hymn and sat in the back corner. Chun remembered noticing him because the man's lips were moving, but no sound came out, as if he were praying in a language only he could hear. When the shooting started, Chun had seen the man's face for just a moment, blank, almost serene, before chaos consumed the sanctuary and the shooter disappeared. The crime scene investigation unit arrived at 10:47 a.m., led by forensic specialist Dr. Yolanda Grant, who had processed crime scenes from the Columbia River to the California border but had never worked a case quite like this. She photographed everything: the blood spatter patterns that would tell the story of how the bullets traveled, the positions of the bodies before they were moved by paramedics, the scattered hymnals and children's drawings that had fluttered to the floor. Two spent shell casings were immediately visible, one near the back pew where the shooter had stood, another in the center aisle where he must have fired the second shot. Dr. Grant bagged them carefully, noting their unusual appearance. These weren't standard factory rounds. They were hand-loaded, with what appeared to be non-standard primer caps. It was a detail that would prove crucial in the hours to come. As Dr. Grant worked her way through the sanctuary, her gloved hands lifting and cataloging evidence with mechanical precision, she discovered a third casing wedged beneath the hymnal rack on the back pew, partially hidden by a church bulletin. This one bore something the others did not. A partial fingerprint visible even to the naked eye, pressed into the brass, where someone had gripped it with unusual force. It was the kind of break that investigators pray for, physical evidence linking a suspect to the scene. But first, they'd need a suspect. And as the morning wore on and witness accounts were compiled into a composite sketch, Kelly knew they were looking for a young man who'd committed a calculated, cold-blooded execution and then walked away as if nothing had happened. By noon, Detective Kelly stood in the church parking lot, watching the medical examiner's van pull away with two child-sized body bags, and felt the weight of the case settle onto his shoulders like a physical burden. The Whitmores had been sedated and taken to Providence Portland Medical Center, where Cormac remained in the waiting room in a catatonic state, and Serafina had to be physically restrained when she tried to follow her children's bodies to the morgue. Witnesses were still being interviewed in the church basement, their accounts varying in detail but consistent in the core facts. A young man, white, late 20s, had entered during the service and murdered two children in cold blood before walking out as calmly as he had entered. The lack of any apparent connection between the shooter and the victims suggested a hate crime, a random act of violence against a progressive church known for its LGBTQ-affirming ministry and social justice advocacy. But Kelly had been a detective long enough to know that nothing about murder was ever truly random. There was always a reason, always a motive, even if that motive was twisted beyond recognition by mental illness or ideology. And as he looked at the Gothic spire of Grace Community Church rising against the gray Portland sky, he knew this case would demand every ounce of skill and determination he possessed. Somewhere out there was a killer who'd just murdered two children in front of their parents and dozens of witnesses. Someone who'd planned this attack carefully enough to bring hand-loaded ammunition. Someone who'd walked out of that church without hesitation, without remorse, without looking back. The question wasn't whether they'd find him. They would. The question was what else they'd discover along the way, and whether the truth, when it finally emerged, would be even more horrifying than the crime itself. By 2 p.m. on November 12th, Detective Marcus Kelly had established a command post in the church offices, where maps of the Alameda neighborhood were spread across tables and photographs of the crime scene were being pinned to bulletin boards with the kind of systematic precision that homicide investigations demand. The FBI had been notified given the potential hate crime angle, and agents from the Portland field office were en route to coordinate with local law enforcement. But Kelly wasn't waiting for federal backup. His immediate priority was identifying the shooter, and he had three promising leads that were already being pursued simultaneously. First, security camera footage from a coffee shop across the street that might have captured the suspect entering or leaving the church. Second, the partial fingerprint on the shell casing that Dr. Grant was even now analyzing in her lab. And third, the witness descriptions that were being compiled into a composite sketch by a forensic artist who'd arrived from downtown Portland. But it was the ammunition itself that provided the most intriguing angle. Dr. Grant had already contacted the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives about the unusual primer compound she'd identified in the shell casings. These weren't your standard factory-loaded rounds that you could buy at any sporting goods store. Someone had taken the time to hand-load these bullets, using a potassium chlorate mixture that was rarely found in modern ammunition. It was old school, the kind of thing you'd see in antique cartridges or specialized military applications, but certainly not in the weapon of your average shooter. The question was why? Why would someone go through the labor-intensive process of hand-loading ammunition when factory rounds were readily available, reliable, and untraceable? The answer, Kelly suspected, was either obsessive attention to detail or an attempt to create something uniquely deadly. Either way, it suggested premeditation, planning, and a level of sophistication that contradicted the image of a random act of violence. The break came faster than anyone expected. At 3:47 p.m., Kelly's phone buzzed with a call from ATF Special Agent Marcus Tobias, who'd run the primer compound analysis through federal databases with remarkable speed. The potassium chlorate mixture wasn't just unusual, it was practically a signature. Only 2 individuals in Oregon had purchased potassium chlorate in quantities sufficient for ammunition reloading in the past 18 months, and the ATF tracked these purchases because the chemical could also be used in explosive devices. One of the buyers, a competitive shooter in Eugene, had been in a hospital bed recovering from hip surgery on November 12th, which gave him the world's best alibi. The second buyer, however, had made the purchase using a credit card registered to a deceased individual, a red flag that had triggered a fraud alert in ATF systems but had been classified as low priority until now. The name on the fraudulent purchase was Edmund Voss, who had died in 2021. But the shipping address was current, a house in Portland's Cully neighborhood registered to Edmund's son, Silas Voss. Detective Kelly felt that first electric thrill of a case beginning to crack open, the sensation every investigator lives for when disparate pieces start aligning in ways that suggest not randomness, but terrible, calculated purpose. He immediately requested a background check on Silas Voss and anyone else living at that address, while simultaneously applying for an expedited search warrant. The judge who reviewed the application had been as horrified by the church shooting as everyone else in Portland, and the warrant was approved with unusual speed. By 5:30 p.m., Kelly was sitting in his unmarked sedan across the street from 4287 Northeast Killingsworth Street, watching the windows for signs of movement, waiting for tactical units to assemble. The house was a modest single-story structure with peeling paint and an overgrown yard, the kind of place that neighbors noticed only when the grass got too high or the trash can stayed on the curb too long. It looked unremarkable, forgettable, but somewhere inside that house was evidence, Kelly was certain, that would connect its occupants to the murder of 2 children. The forensic analysis of the crime scene had continued through the night, with Dr. Grant and her team working under portable lights to ensure no evidence was missed. The 3 shell casings had been confirmed as hand-loaded .223 Remington rounds, unusual for their potassium chlorate primers, which gave them slightly different ballistic characteristics than factory ammunition. The partial fingerprint on the 3rd casing was what Dr. Grant called a beauty, a clear ridge pattern where someone had gripped the brass during the loading process, likely when crimping the bullet into place. But there was something else unusual about that particular casing, something Dr. Grant had noted in her initial report: faint tooth marks on the brass, as if someone had held it between their teeth while working. It was an odd detail, the kind of thing that might seem insignificant until you needed to link a suspect to the physical act of loading the ammunition. Then it became gold. Every piece of evidence was being cataloged, photographed from multiple angles, and secured in the chain of custody that would eventually lead to a courtroom, assuming they could find their shooter and prove he was the one who'd loaded those rounds. At 6:15 a.m. on November 13th, Detective Kelly's phone buzzed with warrant approval, and within minutes, a tactical team was assembling 2 blocks away from the Voss residence. The plan was textbook: secure the residence, detain any occupants for questioning, and execute a thorough search for the murder weapon, additional ammunition, and any evidence linking the occupants to the church shooting. Kelly had briefed his team on the possibility of multiple suspects. The credit card fraud suggested at least one other person with knowledge of the deceased Edmund Voss's financial information, and emphasized the need for extreme caution. They were dealing with someone who'd been willing to murder children in cold blood in front of dozens of witnesses. There was no predicting how such a person might react when cornered. As the first gray light of dawn began to illuminate the Portland skyline, the team moved into position, their boots crunching on fallen leaves as they approached the house from multiple angles, weapons drawn, adrenaline pumping. The front door came down with a single ram strike at 6:22 a.m., and officers flooded into the house with shouts of "Police! Search warrant! Show your hands!" In the living room, they found a woman in a wheelchair, later identified as Marigold Voss, 62 years old, paralyzed from a stroke 3 years earlier. She began screaming in confusion and terror, her limited cognitive function making it impossible for her to understand what was happening. Officers tried to calm her while continuing to clear the rest of the house. In the back bedroom, they found him, Gideon Collins, 28 years old, asleep in a twin bed surrounded by religious texts, notebooks filled with handwritten screeds, and a laptop still open to a web page about martyrdom in early Christianity. Collins didn't resist as officers dragged him from the bed and cuffed his hands behind his back. His face showed that same blank, serene expression that Reverend Chun had described from the church, as if being arrested for double homicide was just another ordinary moment in an ordinary day. But it was the basement that would provide the evidence Kelly needed to build an airtight case. Officers descended the stairs and discovered what could only be described as a workshop of death. Reloading equipment arranged with obsessive precision, boxes of brass casings, containers of gunpowder, and a jar of potassium chlorate labeled with a chemical supply company logo that matched ATF records. Detective Kelly descended into that basement at 6:45 a.m., his eyes adjusting to the fluorescent glare from overhead lights, and felt a cold certainty settle in his chest. This was not the impulsive act of a mentally ill individual who'd snapped under pressure. This was methodical preparation by someone who had planned every detail of a massacre. The reloading bench was organized with almost pathological precision. Each tool hung in its designated spot, each container labeled and dated with the kind of attention to detail you'd expect from a professional machinist or a scientist. Kelly found a logbook documenting the creation of each batch of ammunition, including notes about primer composition and bullet weight written in neat, careful handwriting. And there, on a page dated November 10th, just 2 days before the shooting, someone had loaded 3 rounds using the potassium chlorate primers and noted them in the log with a single word: cleansing. The handwriting would need to be analyzed by an expert, but Kelly was willing to bet his pension it would match samples taken from Gideon Collins. The search of Collins's bedroom yielded what would become the cornerstone of the prosecution's case: a 47-page manifesto titled "The Innocent Must Burn First." The document was a disturbing blend of biblical quotations taken wildly out of context, pseudo-philosophical ramblings about the nature of innocence and salvation, and specific references to Grace Community Church and its youth ministers' advocacy for LGBTQ inclusion. Collins had written about the need for a blood sacrifice to awaken the faithful, arguing that killing children would force their parents and the broader community to reckon with the consequences of abandoning traditional Christian values. The manifesto included hand-drawn diagrams of Grace Community Church's interior, complete with notations about the location of exits and sightlines from various pews. This wasn't a random act of violence. It was a targeted terrorist attack against a specific congregation, planned with chilling deliberation over a period of months. Kelly bagged the manifesto as evidence, knowing that defense attorneys would later try to use it to establish an insanity defense, but also knowing that the level of planning and detail actually worked against such a claim. Insane people don't typically create architectural diagrams and tactical plans. They act on impulse, on delusion, on the voices in their heads. Collins had acted on calculation, ideology, and cold, rational planning. There was a difference, and Kelly intended to make sure a jury understood that difference when the time came. At 7:30 a.m., Detective Kelly sat across from Gideon Collins in an interview room at the Portland Police Bureau's Central Precinct, the suspect's hands still cuffed and resting on a metal table. Collins had waived his right to an attorney, a decision Kelly suspected he would later regret, and seemed almost eager to talk, his eyes bright with a fervor that made Kelly's skin crawl. When asked about the church shooting, Collins didn't deny his involvement. Instead, he launched into a rambling explanation about divine mission and the necessity of sacrifice, speaking about Allara and Thaddeus Whitmore not as children he had murdered, but as souls delivered to God before Satan could claim them. His voice was calm, measured, as if discussing a successful business transaction rather than the execution of 2 kids. Kelly let him talk, the recorder capturing every word, knowing that this confession would eliminate any possibility of an insanity defense. Collins was clearly delusional, yes, but he was equally clearly aware that what he had done was illegal and would be viewed by society as murder. The legal standard for sanity, understanding the nature and wrongfulness of one's acts, had just been met in Collins's own words. The fingerprint results came back at 9:15 a.m., and they were a perfect match to Gideon Collins. 14 points of comparison, well above the threshold needed for courtroom admissibility. The print connected Collins definitively to the shell casing found beneath the hymnal rack at Grace Community Church. and those tooth marks on the brass. Kelly sent officers to track down Collins's former roommate, a graduate student named Aaron Pritchard, who had lived with Collins for 6 months before moving out due to what he called increasingly disturbing behavior. Pritchard would later testify that Collins had a habit of holding bullets between his teeth while crimping them into casings, a technique he claimed gave him better control over the process. It was a small detail, but it was exactly the kind of detail that turned circumstantial evidence into an unbreakable chain linking suspect to crime scene to victims. By noon on November 13th, Kelly had more than enough evidence to charge Gideon Collins with 2 counts of aggravated murder. But the investigation was just beginning to reveal its full scope. The credit card fraud, the specialized ammunition components, the missing father figure, Silas Voss, all pointed to something larger than one disturbed individual acting alone. This was a conspiracy, Kelly realized, and conspiracies always had multiple players. The question was how deep it went, who else was involved, and whether Silas Voss had been merely an enabler or something far more sinister, the architect of his son's transformation from seminary student to domestic terrorist. As Kelly reviewed the evidence spread across his desk, the manifesto, the fingerprint match, the confession, the ammunition components, he knew the case against Gideon Collins was solid enough to secure a conviction. But his gut told him that the horrors of November 12th were only the beginning of a deeper, darker truth that would shake Portland to its core. The investigation into Gideon Collins's background began immediately after his arrest, and what emerged was a trajectory that mental health experts would later describe as textbook radicalization. A slow, methodical descent from promising theology student to expelled extremist to domestic terrorist. Collins had been accepted to Mount Angel Seminary in 2019, a prestigious Catholic institution in Oregon where seminarians trained for the priesthood. By all accounts, he'd initially excelled in his theological studies, demonstrating a sharp mind and a genuine passion for Scripture. His professors remembered him as intense, deeply committed, the kind of student who would stay after class to debate fine points of doctrine. But somewhere during his second year, that intensity began to curdle into something darker. Collins's interpretation of Scripture became increasingly rigid, uncompromising, and his attitude toward fellow students who expressed more progressive views turned confrontational, even hostile. In early 2022, Collins submitted a paper for his systematic theology course that raised immediate red flags among the faculty. The paper argued that the Catholic Church had been infiltrated by agents of Satan, promoting LGBTQ inclusion and women's ordination, and that violent resistance was not only justified but required by true believers. The language was inflammatory, the reasoning was circular, and the conclusions were disturbing enough that his professor forwarded the paper to the seminary's administration with a strongly worded recommendation that Collins receive psychological evaluation. The seminary expelled him in March 2022, citing his inability to embrace the church's teachings on love, mercy, and pastoral care. It was a decision made reluctantly. The faculty genuinely wanted to help Collins, but ultimately deemed necessary for the safety of other students and the integrity of the program. Collins responded to his expulsion by writing the first draft of what would become his 47-page manifesto, expanding it over the following 18 months into the document that would serve as both his confession and his condemnation. But Collins wasn't radicalized in isolation. The role of his father, Silas Voss, began to emerge as detectives interviewed Marigold Voss and searched through decades of family documents. Silas was a 58-year-old former military contractor who had spent the 1990s working in conflict zones, Iraq, Afghanistan, Bosnia, places where violence was currency and survival meant embracing brutality. He'd returned to the United States with what appeared to be untreated PTSD and a worldview that had been fundamentally warped by prolonged exposure to war. Marigold, speaking haltingly from her wheelchair, her cognitive abilities severely limited by the stroke that had paralyzed her 3 years earlier, described decades of psychological abuse. Silas had subjected Gideon to what could only be called a twisted form of religious education, framing violence as holy warfare and teaching the boy that true Christians must be willing to kill in defense of their faith. It wasn't discipline. It was indoctrination, systematic and deliberate, beginning when Gideon was young enough to have no frame of reference for what normal family life looked like. Silas had been absent from the house during the raid on November 13th, and his current whereabouts were unknown. But a review of the family's financial records showed that he had purchased a Ruger AR-556 rifle, the same model used in the church shooting, from a licensed dealer in Gresham, Oregon, 6 months earlier. The purchase was legal at the time. Silas had no criminal record, passed the federal background check, and paid cash. But combined with the ammunition components ordered using Edmund Voss's fraudulent credit card, it raised the disturbing possibility that Silas had not only radicalized his son, but had also provided him with the means to commit mass murder. Detective Kelly requested an all-points bulletin for Silas Voss at 2 p.m. on November 13th, describing him as a person of interest in the church shooting investigation and potentially armed and dangerous. The investigation was no longer just about one disturbed individual. It was about a conspiracy between father and son, a multi-generational commitment to violence in the name of religious purity. The forensic examination of Gideon Collins's laptop yielded a treasure trove of evidence that painted a picture of obsessive planning and ideological radicalization that had been building for years. Collins had visited the Grace Community Church website 47 times in the 6 months before the shooting, downloading the Sunday service schedule, staff directory, and photographs of the sanctuary. He'd created detailed notes about the church's layout, including the positions of security cameras, which, in a cruel irony, had malfunctioned 2 weeks before the attack and had not yet been repaired. Collins had also engaged in extensive online research about ammunition ballistics, searching for information about which calibers and bullet types would be most effective for his purposes. His browser history showed visits to extremist Christian forums where users discussed the concept of redemptive violence and shared manifestos from other attackers who had targeted religious institutions they deemed heretical. Perhaps most chilling was the discovery of a video file dated November 11, 2023, the day before the shooting, in which Gideon Collins recorded what he clearly intended as a posthumous message to the world. In the 22-minute video, Collins sat in his bedroom wearing the same dark jacket he would wear the next day, explaining his actions in the calm, rational tone of someone outlining a business plan. There was no ranting, no screaming, no obvious signs of psychosis. Just a young man methodically laying out his reasoning for why he was about to murder children in a church. He spoke about his expulsion from Mount Angel Seminary as a turning point, describing it as the moment I realized the institutional church had been corrupted beyond redemption. He identified Grace Community Church specifically because of its youth ministers' advocacy for LGBTQ inclusion, which Collins viewed as the ultimate perversion of Christian doctrine. And he explained his decision to target children with a twisted logic that made Detective Kelly's blood run cold when he first watched the video. By killing Allara and Thaddeus Whitmore before they could be fully indoctrinated into their parents' progressive beliefs, Collins argued, he was saving their souls and sending them to heaven as innocents. It was Abraham and Isaac logic, he said, the willingness to sacrifice what you love most to prove your devotion to God. Except Abraham had been stopped by an angel. Collins had no intention of being stopped. The video also contained a detail that would prove crucial in later proceedings. Collins thanked his father for showing me the path of righteous warfare and giving me the tools to complete God's mission. The statement was vague enough to provide plausible deniability for Silas, but combined with the gun purchase records and the credit card fraud, it painted a picture of active conspiracy. Detective Kelly knew that proving Silas's direct involvement would require more than circumstantial evidence, but the pieces were falling into place, and he was confident that when they finally found Silas Voss, they'd have enough to charge him as a co-conspirator. The cell phone records came back on November 16th, and they were damning. Silas's phone had pinged off a tower near Grace Community Church at 10:05 a.m. on November 12th, just 12 minutes before the shooting. The phone had remained in the vicinity until 10:19 a.m., then moved rapidly east toward the Voss residence, suggesting that Silas had dropped his son off, waited nearby, and fled when he heard the sirens. It was exactly the kind of logistical support you'd expect from someone with military training, someone who understood the importance of extraction plans and avoiding detection. The cell phone data transformed Silas from a background figure into an active participant, someone who had been present at the scene and had facilitated his son's escape, or at least attempted to before Gideon chose to walk away on foot instead of waiting for pickup. On November 17th, a witness came forward who would crack the case wide open. Margaret Thorne, a 67-year-old parishioner at Grace Community Church, had been running late on November 12th and was rushing across the parking lot when she noticed a man sitting in an older model Ford truck with the engine running. She had thought it odd at the time. Who sits in a parking lot with the engine running during a church service? But she'd been too focused on getting inside before the service started to pay close attention. Now, seeing news coverage that included a photograph of Silas Voss, she realized with shocking clarity that the man in the truck had been the suspect's father. Margaret provided a detailed description of the vehicle, a dark blue Ford F-150 with a dented rear fender, and recalled that the man had been staring at the church entrance with an intensity that had briefly made her uneasy. She'd even made brief eye contact with him, she said, and the look in his eyes had been strange. Not nervous, not excited, just focused, like someone waiting for something important to happen. DMV records confirmed that Silas Voss owned a 2006 Ford F-150 matching that description, and when officers located the vehicle at a storage unit rented under an alias, they found it exactly as Margaret had described, complete with the dented fender. The truck became a gold mine of evidence when crime scene technicians processed it on November 18th. Fibers in the passenger seat matched the fabric of the jacket Gideon Collins had worn during the shooting. A partial boot print in the floor mat matched boots seized from Collins's bedroom. More significantly, investigators found a single spent .223 shell casing under the passenger seat, identical in every respect to the rounds used in the church shooting. The casing bore no fingerprints. It had likely been handled with gloves, but its presence in Silas's vehicle established beyond doubt that he had knowledge of and access to the murder weapon and ammunition. The accumulating evidence painted a picture not of a lone wolf terrorist, but of a father-son conspiracy, with Silas serving as the logistical support and ideological architect, while Gideon carried out the actual attack. Detective Kelly obtained an arrest warrant for Silas Voss on November 19th, charging him with conspiracy to commit murder, accessory to murder, and weapons violations. The manhunt intensified, with federal marshals joining the search and Silas's photograph distributed to law enforcement agencies across the Pacific Northwest. Kelly suspected that Silas had gone to ground immediately after the shooting, possibly with the help of like-minded extremists in the survivalist community, where men like him could disappear for weeks or months if they had the right connections. Financial records showed no credit card activity since November 12th, and his cell phone had been powered off since that same day, suggesting someone with enough tactical knowledge to avoid electronic tracking. The search would continue for weeks, but Kelly was confident that Silas would eventually be found. Men like him couldn't resist the urge to justify their actions, to explain themselves, to find validation for their beliefs. That need for validation would ultimately lead to his capture. While the manhunt for Silas continued, the prosecution team, led by Multnomah County Deputy District Attorney Diana Silva, began building the case against Gideon Collins. Silva was a 42-year-old prosecutor with a reputation for thorough preparation and courtroom tenacity, the kind of lawyer who left nothing to chance and who could take complex forensic evidence and make it comprehensible to a jury of ordinary citizens. She reviewed the evidence with meticulous attention: the fingerprint match, the confession video, the manifesto, the witness testimony, the ammunition trace. It all formed an interlocking web that left no reasonable doubt about Collins's guilt. Silva's challenge wouldn't be proving that Collins committed the murders. He'd essentially confessed on video, but rather convincing a jury that he deserved the ultimate punishment despite his obvious mental disturbance. The death penalty was legally available in Oregon only for aggravated murder, and the fact that Collins had targeted children in a house of worship clearly met that threshold. Silva also had to consider the coming revelation about Silas's role. When the father was eventually captured and his involvement fully exposed, it could complicate the narrative but also strengthen the case for premeditation. A defendant who acted alone in a moment of religious psychosis might generate some sympathy from a jury. But a defendant who conspired with his father over months of careful planning? That was harder to excuse. Silva began reaching out to the Whitmore family through victim advocates, preparing them for the long ordeal of a capital murder trial and the possibility that the full truth about their children's deaths would be even more devastating than they could imagine. Cormac and Serafina Whitmore were still in a fog of grief, barely functional despite counseling and medication. But Silva knew that their presence in the courtroom, their victim impact statements, would be crucial to securing the outcome they deserved: justice for Allara and Thaddeus. The case was assigned to Multnomah County Circuit Court Judge Elizabeth Harmon, a former prosecutor with 12 years on the bench and a reputation for running a tight courtroom. Judge Harmon set the trial date for June 2024, giving both sides 7 months to prepare, a timeline that Silva considered both reasonable and necessary given the complexity of the evidence and the need to locate Silas Voss. The defense team, led by public defender Nathan Cross, immediately filed motions seeking a mental health evaluation for Collins and hinting at a possible insanity defense. Silva opposed the motions vigorously, arguing that Collins's confession video demonstrated clear awareness of right and wrong, but Judge Harmon granted the evaluation in the interest of thoroughness. The resulting report, completed in January 2024, would find Collins legally sane despite his delusional beliefs, clearing the way for a trial that would captivate Oregon and horrify the nation. The search for Silas Voss ended on November 22, 2023, after a tip led federal marshals to a compound near John Day, Oregon, a remote area in the eastern part of the state where survivalist communities had flourished for decades, isolated from government oversight and populated by people who shared Silas's apocalyptic worldview and deep distrust of authority. The compound consisted of several trailers and outbuildings surrounded by chain-link fencing, with hand-painted signs warning about trespassers and the Second Amendment. Investigators had learned that Silas had connections to this community dating back to his military contractor days, when he'd returned from overseas assignments and sought out people who understood his particular brand of paranoia and preparation for societal collapse. The raid on the compound resulted in a tense standoff that lasted 6 hours, with Silas barricaded inside one of the trailers, shouting biblical verses about persecution and martyrdom, while federal negotiators tried to talk him into surrendering peacefully. When Silas finally emerged at 4:30 p.m., his hands raised in surrender, he was immediately taken into custody and transported back to Portland to face charges as a co-conspirator in the church shooting. He was arraigned on November 23 and charged with conspiracy to commit murder, accessory to murder, evidence tampering, and fraud related to the credit card scheme involving his deceased father's financial accounts. His capture completed the picture of a multi-generational conspiracy and set the stage for revelations that would shock even seasoned investigators who thought they'd seen everything. When detectives interviewed Silas on November 23, he initially refused to answer questions, invoking his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination with the rehearsed confidence of someone who'd thought through this scenario many times. But as the interview progressed and detectives laid out the evidence against him, the gun purchase, the truck, the presence near the church, the ammunition components, the financial records, the planning documents with his handwriting, Silas's facade of stoic resistance began to crack. He eventually admitted that he had driven Gideon to Grace Community Church on November 12, but claimed, unconvincingly, that he believed his son was going to distribute religious pamphlets and stage a peaceful protest against the church's progressive teachings. It was a transparent lie that contradicted virtually every piece of evidence in the case, but it represented Silas's attempt to distance himself from direct knowledge of the murders. Detectives pressed harder, confronting him with the G's mission file found in his bedroom and his own handwriting in the ammunition logbook, and Silas finally admitted he had known Gideon planned an action, but claimed he had tried to talk him out of violence. The claim that Silas had tried to dissuade Gideon was contradicted by the decades of radicalization, the practical support in acquiring weapons and ammunition, and the logistical assistance on the morning of the attack. Detectives suspected that Silas was attempting to construct a defense based on the idea that he was a concerned father trying to manage a troubled son, when in reality, he had been the architect of Gideon's transformation into a terrorist. The ATF analysis of the ammunition components found in the Voss basement provided a timeline of premeditation that stretched back 5 months before the church shooting. Special Agent Marcus Tobias had traced the potassium chlorate purchase to a specialty chemical supplier in Idaho that catered primarily to mining operations and required customers to provide detailed information about intended use. The purchase record showed that Edmund Voss had claimed the material was for gold or processing, a plausible cover story that had passed cursory review. The credit card used for the transaction was indeed registered to Edmund Voss, who had died of pancreatic cancer in August 2021, but the account had remained active due to automatic payments set up before his death and the bank's failure to flag the account when the death certificate was filed. Someone with access to Edmund's financial information had kept the account alive and used it to purchase materials that no legitimate buyer would need for recreational ammunition reloading. It was sophisticated financial fraud, the kind that required planning and knowledge of how banking systems worked. Detective Kelly obtained Edmund Voss's estate records on November 14th, discovering that Silas had been the executor and sole beneficiary of his father's estate. Silas had legal access to all of Edmund's financial accounts and could have easily maintained the credit card without raising immediate red flags. The pattern suggested a level of planning and criminal sophistication that went beyond Gideon Collins's religious delusions, indicating that Silas had not only indoctrinated his son, but had also provided the infrastructure for the attack. Bank records showed that Silas had made cash withdrawals totaling $3,200 in the 3 weeks before the shooting, amounts that could not be accounted for in normal household expenses and suggested payment for something or someone off the books. What that money had been used for remained unclear, but Kelly suspected it might have been payment to associates in the survivalist community who had helped Silas prepare for the aftermath of the attack, perhaps securing safe houses or arranging for false identification documents. The forensic examination of the basement workshop where the ammunition had been loaded became the focus of intense scrutiny. Dr. Yolanda Grant spent 8 hours in that space on November 13th, carefully documenting the layout and collecting samples of every chemical and component present. The reloading bench itself was dusted for fingerprints, revealing overlapping prints from both Gideon and Silas, confirming that both men had worked on the ammunition creation process. A half-empty container of potassium chlorate showed fingerprints matching Silas exclusively, suggesting he had been the one to acquire and handle the specialized primer compound. The logbook documenting ammunition batches was written in Gideon's handwriting, but notations in the margins, corrections to powder measurements, suggestions for primer seating depth, were in a different hand that would later be confirmed as Silas's. The physical evidence painted a picture of a father teaching his son not just an ideology, but the practical skills needed to carry out an attack. This wasn't passive enablement, it was active collaboration. The discovery of additional planning documents in Silas's bedroom provided prosecutors with even more damning evidence of conspiracy. The file labeled G's Mission contained printouts of the Grace Community Church website, handwritten notes about optimal shooting positions, and a crude timeline showing November 12th circled in red with the notation 10:15 a.m., opening him, maximum attendance. The level of detail was extraordinary. Silas had researched not just the church's layout, but also the typical flow of Sunday services, the arrival patterns of congregants, and even the demographics of the congregation, noting that Grace Community had a high percentage of young families with children. The implications were stomach-turning. Silas hadn't just enabled his son's attack. He'd helped plan it with the precision of a military operation, identifying the optimal time to maximize casualties and ensuring that children would be present. This wasn't religious extremism operating in isolation. It was tactical planning informed by Silas's years of experience in conflict zones, applied to a domestic target with deadly effectiveness. FBI document examiner Patricia Reynolds analyzed the handwriting in these planning documents and testified to investigators that the notes were written by at least 2 different individuals over a period of months. Some entries were dated as far back as June 2023, 6 months before the shooting, suggesting that the conspiracy had been in development for far longer than initially suspected. Reynolds identified Silas's handwriting in tactical observations about the church layout, including notes about the positioning of security cameras, potential escape routes, and lines of sight from various pews. She identified Gideon's handwriting in theological justifications and target selection criteria, including disturbing notations about which families attended regularly and which children would be most symbolic as victims. The collaboration evident in these documents demolished any remaining possibility that Silas had been merely a passive enabler or that Gideon had acted independently. Surveillance footage obtained from a gas station 2 blocks from Grace Community Church, timestamped at 10:02 a.m. on November 12th, provided visual confirmation of Silas's direct involvement. The grainy but clear footage showed Silas's Ford F-150 pulling up to the curb, the passenger door opening, and a figure matching Gideon Collins's description exiting the truck with a long object wrapped in a blanket. The figure walked out of frame in the direction of the church, and the truck remained parked for approximately 15 minutes before driving away, timing that coincided exactly with the shooting and immediate aftermath. Prosecutors would later freeze-frame the video on a shot showing the truck's license plate, which matched Silas's vehicle registration. While the footage didn't definitively show what was in the blanket or provide a perfect view of the passenger's face, combined with the cell phone records, the witness testimony from Margaret Thorne, and the physical evidence in the truck, it painted a devastating picture of Silas dropping his son off to commit mass murder and then fleeing when sirens approached. The relationship between Silas and Gideon, as it emerged through interviews with extended family members and former neighbors, was profoundly disturbing. Marigold Voss, despite her cognitive limitations, provided fragments of information that helped investigators understand the household dynamics. She described Silas as controlling and paranoid, someone who homeschooled Gideon to prevent contamination by liberal education, and who subjected the boy to rigorous physical training from a young age. Neighbors recalled seeing Gideon as a teenager running obstacle courses in the backyard at dawn, practicing with what appeared to be replica firearms, and spending hours in the garage with his father doing activities that were never quite visible from the street. One former neighbor, interviewed on November 20th, recalled an incident from 2015 when she'd called Child Protective Services after hearing Silas screaming at 12-year-old Gideon about being soft and weak like your mother. CPS had investigated but found insufficient evidence of physical abuse to remove the child from the home, a decision that would haunt the caseworker who'd made that determination. Extended family members painted a picture of Silas as someone who had been fundamentally changed by his experiences overseas. A cousin who'd known Silas before his military contracting work described him as basically normal, maybe a little intense about religion, but nothing extreme. But when Silas returned from Iraq in 2004, something had shifted. He'd become obsessed with end-times prophecy, convinced that Western civilization was under attack from within, and determined to raise his son to be a warrior for Christ in what he believed would be an inevitable religious war. The cousin had stopped visiting the Voss household after an uncomfortable Thanksgiving dinner in 2008, where Silas had spent 2 hours lecturing about the need for violent resistance against progressive Christianity. It wasn't just his beliefs, the cousin told investigators. It was the look in his eyes when he talked about it, like he was already planning something. And little Gideon just sat there absorbing every word like it was gospel truth. Financial records revealed that Silas had been systematically draining Edmund Voss's estate since 2021, using the funds not for household expenses or medical care for Marigold, but for stockpiling weapons, ammunition, and survival supplies. Receipts found in the locked filing cabinet showed purchases from gun shows, outdoor suppliers, and military surplus stores totaling more than $45,000 over 3 years. Among these purchases were tactical training manuals, books on guerrilla warfare, and disturbing texts about religious violence throughout history. One particularly chilling find was a book titled The Turner Diaries, a notorious white supremacist novel that had inspired several domestic terrorists, with passages heavily underlined and margin notes in Silas's handwriting connecting the fictional violence in the book to biblical passages. The book had been published in 1978 and had influenced numerous hate crimes and terrorist attacks over the decades, and its presence in Silas's collection suggested his radicalization drew from multiple extremist ideologies, not just religious fundamentalism. Cell phone records revealed communication patterns between Silas and Gideon that intensified dramatically in the weeks before November 12th. Text messages, later recovered from Gideon's phone, showed Silas providing encouragement and tactical advice. On November 5th, 1 week before the shooting, Silas had texted, "Remember what we discussed. Commit fully or don't commit at all. Half measures accomplish nothing." On November 10th, he'd written, "The Lord has given you a mission. Be worthy of it." And on the morning of November 12th, at 8:47 a.m., Silas had sent a final message. "Today you become what I trained you to be. Make it count." These messages obliterated any remaining claim that Silas hadn't known about or supported Gideon's plans. They were explicit encouragement to carry out violence, sent by a father to a son he'd spent decades molding into a weapon. When prosecutors reviewed all the evidence, the financial records, the planning documents, the ammunition components, the surveillance footage, the text messages, the witness testimony, they concluded that Silas Voss was not merely an accomplice, but the primary architect of the November 12th attack. Gideon had been the trigger man, yes, but Silas had provided the ideology, the training, the weapons, the tactical planning, and the logistical support. Without Silas, Gideon would likely have remained a troubled young man with extreme beliefs, but no means or motivation to act on them. With Silas's guidance, he became a domestic terrorist responsible for the deaths of 2 children and, ultimately, the destruction of an entire family. The question facing prosecutors now was how to charge both men in a way that reflected their respective culpability while ensuring that both faced the full weight of justice. Diana Silva knew that proving conspiracy would be straightforward. The evidence was overwhelming. But she also knew that Silas's trial, when it eventually occurred, would need to establish not just his involvement in this specific attack, but the years of psychological abuse and indoctrination that had made Gideon into what he became. In March 2024, as prosecutor Diana Silva prepared for the June trial, she received news that would transform the entire case and add layers of horror she had not anticipated. A routine DNA analysis of evidence from the crime scene, conducted to ensure chain of custody and rule out contamination, had revealed something extraordinary. Genetic material found on Thaddeus Whitmore's clothing showed a familial match to samples taken from Gideon Collins during his arrest. Further testing confirmed what seemed impossible. Thaddeus Whitmore was Gideon Collins's biological son. Silva sat in stunned silence in her office as the forensic geneticist explained the implications, then immediately called Detective Kelly to discuss how this revelation had occurred and what it meant for the case they'd been building. The investigation that followed would uncover a crime that predated the church shooting by 7 years, a sexual assault that had never been reported, a pregnancy attributed to the wrong father, and a secret that had remained buried until forensic science accidentally exposed it. The timeline investigators pieced together was devastating. 7 years earlier, in the spring of 2017, Gideon Collins had attended a church social event at Grace Community Church, back when he was still exploring different congregations before enrolling at Mount Angel Seminary. He encountered Serafina Whitmore at that event, who was then pregnant with Allara and attending alone while Cormac was traveling for work. What happened that night had never been reported to police, and Serafina apparently had no clear memory of any assault. She attributed her subsequent pregnancy with Thaddeus to her husband, never suspecting that her second child had been conceived through violence. The DNA revelation forced Silva to make an agonizing decision about disclosure. She was legally obligated to share evidence with the defense, and while the DNA wasn't exculpatory in the traditional sense, it didn't prove Collins innocent of murder. It did provide a potential alternative motive that the defense might use to argue against the death penalty. If Collins had killed Thaddeus to eliminate evidence of a sexual assault, that was still first-degree murder, but arguably driven by self-preservation rather than pure ideological extremism. Silva wrestled with the ethical and strategic implications for days. Should she disclose this information that would devastate the Whitmore family all over again? Did she have a choice? Legal ethics were clear. Potentially exculpatory evidence must be disclosed, even when it complicated the narrative or hurt victims. Silva scheduled a meeting with Cormac and Serafina for April 5th, dreading the conversation but knowing it could not be avoided. She consulted with victim advocates about the best way to deliver news that would retroactively poison even the Whitmores' memories of their son. How do you tell parents that the child they lost was conceived through sexual assault? How do you explain that the man who murdered their children was also the biological father of one of them? The meeting with the Whitmores took place in a victim advocate's office with counselors present to provide immediate support when Silva delivered the news. She had rehearsed multiple approaches, gentle, clinical, direct, but ultimately decided that there was no way to soften this blow. When she told Serafina that Thaddeus had been Gideon Collins's biological son, the result of a non-consensual encounter years earlier, Serafina's face went blank with shock before she vomited into a trash can. The physical reaction was immediate and visceral, her body rejecting information that her mind couldn't process. Cormac, Processing the revelation that the boy he had raised and loved was not genetically his son, began to hyperventilate, his face turning red as he struggled to breathe. Silva called for medical assistance, and both Whitmores were briefly hospitalized for acute stress reaction, their already fragile mental states shattered by a truth that made their grief infinitely more complicated and painful. When Cormac Whitmore had recovered enough to speak coherently, he made a request that Silva knew she could not grant. He wanted the DNA evidence sealed and kept from the trial, arguing that it would humiliate his wife, taint his son's memory, and serve no purpose except to give the defense ammunition for their case. Silva explained gently but firmly that the evidence was now part of the case file and that the defense would certainly use it, probably arguing that Collins had killed his own child to hide evidence of the original assault. Cormac's response was visceral rage. He screamed at Silva that she was re-victimizing his family, that the system seemed designed to torture the innocent while protecting the guilty. Silva absorbed his anger with professional composure, understanding that Cormac wasn't really attacking her, but rather lashing out at a universe that had subjected him to unimaginable cruelty. She promised that she would do everything in her power to ensure the DNA evidence was presented in a way that didn't blame Serafina or diminish the horror of what Collins had done. Further investigation into the 2017 incident revealed details that made the assault even more calculated and disturbing. Forensic toxicology advances had allowed testing of hair samples that Serafina had saved from Thaddeus for sentimental reasons, baby curls preserved in a memory box, the kind of keepsake parents treasure. The hair had preserved trace amounts of chemicals that could be detected years later, and analysis revealed the presence of GHB metabolites, remnants of gamma-hydroxybutyric acid, commonly known as a date rape drug. The metabolites in Thaddeus's hair would have been passed from mother to child if Serafina had been drugged at the time of conception. The findings suggested that Serafina had been chemically incapacitated during the encounter with Collins, transforming what might have been ambiguous circumstances into clear evidence of drug-facilitated sexual assault. This wasn't a case of misunderstood consent or drunken regret. This was premeditated chemical incapacitation followed by assault. The revelation added another dimension to Collins's depravity. He hadn't just murdered children for ideological reasons. He had a history of calculated violence against women that predated his radicalization by years. Silva used this evidence to argue that the DNA finding proved not an alternative motive, but rather an additional layer of Collins's criminal character. Collins had sexually assaulted Serafina in 2017, fathered a child through that assault, and then 7 years later returned to kill that child along with his half-sister. The question was whether Collins had known about his biological connection to Thaddeus at the time of the shooting. If he'd known, it suggested the murder was partly about erasing evidence of his previous crime or eliminating what he might have viewed as his impure lineage. If he hadn't known, it meant he'd unknowingly killed his own biological child, which added a layer of tragic irony, but didn't fundamentally change his culpability for the murders. Detective Kelly was tasked with determining whether Collins had known about his paternity. He returned to Collins's seized laptop and conducted a deeper forensic analysis of deleted files and browser history. What he found was chilling. In October 2023, just weeks before the shooting, Collins had researched DNA testing services and had visited websites about proving paternity. The search history included queries like, can DNA tests be done without mother knowing? How accurate are paternity tests? And statute of limitations sexual assault Oregon. The searches suggested Collins had suspected or discovered his relationship to Thaddeus and had been grappling with that knowledge in the weeks leading up to the attack. More disturbing still, investigators found a draft email on Collins's laptop, never sent, addressed to Serafina Whitmore. The email, dated October 28, 2023, read, "You probably don't remember me, but I remember that night at the church social in 2017. I've been watching your family. There are consequences for sin, and they're coming soon." The draft email was never sent. Collins had apparently decided that anonymity was more important than taunting his victim, but its existence proved that Collins knew about the assault, knew about Thaddeus, and had been planning something involving the Whitmore family for weeks before the shooting. Silva realized that the DNA evidence actually strengthened her case rather than weakening it. Collins hadn't killed Thaddeus solely to hide evidence of a past crime. Too much time had passed for that to be the primary motive. Instead, the evidence suggested that Collins's religious extremism had twisted into self-loathing, and that murdering his own biological child was part of his concept of cleansing and purification. The manifesto's language about burning away impurity took on new meaning in light of the DNA evidence. Collins had created what he viewed as a stain on his own soul, a child born from sin, and his twisted ideology demanded that stain be eliminated along with the corruption he saw in Grace Community Church. Defense attorney Nathan Cross received the DNA disclosure in mid-April and immediately recognized its potential to complicate the prosecution's narrative. During a pretrial hearing on April 20th, Cross argued that the DNA evidence proved Collins had personal motives beyond religious extremism, specifically the desire to eliminate evidence of a prior crime and avoid prosecution for sexual assault. Cross contended that this evidence supported a theory of rational, self-interested criminality rather than delusional religious mania, which could actually argue against the death penalty by showing Collins was driven by understandable, if abhorrent, human motivations rather than incomprehensible ideology. Judge Harmon ruled that the DNA evidence would be admissible at trial, as it was relevant to motive and could be considered by the jury when determining Collins's mental state and culpability. The ruling meant that the full horror of Collins's crimes, both the 2017 assault and the 2023 murders, would be exposed in open court. Silva began preparing Serafina to testify about the assault, a process that required extraordinary sensitivity and patience. Serafina had suppressed or genuinely forgotten the events of that night in 2017. The human mind has remarkable capacity to protect itself from traumatic memories, and trying to reconstruct what happened meant forcing her to confront violations she'd successfully avoided processing for 7 years. Through multiple therapy sessions and careful interviewing, fragments of memory began to emerge. Serafina recalled drinking wine at the church social, feeling suddenly dizzy and disoriented far beyond what 2 glasses of wine should have caused, and finding herself in a back room with gaps in her memory. She remembered Collins's face hovering over hers, remembered trying to say no or stop, but her mouth not forming the words properly. Then nothing until she woke up on a couch in the church basement, alone, with her clothes disheveled and a pounding headache. She'd never reported the incident because she wasn't entirely sure what had happened, blamed herself for drinking too much, and felt ashamed. When she discovered she was pregnant a month later, she attributed it to Cormac without question. They were trying for a second child, and it never occurred to her that Thaddeus might not be her husband's son. The revelation that Collins had drugged and assaulted her, that Thaddeus was the product of that assault, and that Collins had later murdered the child born from his own crime, created a psychological burden that Serafina described as unbearable. She told Silva during one preparation session that learning about the assault was in some ways worse than losing her children, because it contaminated her memories of Thaddeus's entire life. Every birthday, every bedtime story, every moment of joy she'd experienced with her son was now tainted by the knowledge of how he'd been conceived. The prosecution team debated how prominently to feature the DNA evidence at trial. Some argued for downplaying it, mentioning it briefly as additional context, but not making it central to the case, which was strong enough without it. Others, including Silva, argued for confronting it head-on and using it to demonstrate the full scope of Collins's criminality. Silva ultimately decided that transparency was the best approach. The evidence would come out anyway. Cross would certainly raise it. So better to control the narrative and frame it as proof of Collins's long-standing pattern of violence rather than let the defense use it to muddy the waters about motivation. Silva would argue that Collins had committed 2 separate sets of crimes: sexual assault in 2017 and murder in 2023, with the later crimes being informed by, but not excused by the earlier ones. The DNA evidence showed that Collins was not merely a religious extremist, but a predator who had victimized the Whitmore family twice, 7 years apart, with devastating consequences each time. As the trial date approached, both sides prepared for how the DNA revelation would play in court. Cross planned to use it to argue for life without parole rather than death, contending that Collins's crimes, while heinous, were driven by comprehensible human motivations: guilt, fear of exposure, self-preservation, rather than the incomprehensible religious delusions that might warrant the ultimate punishment. Silva planned to argue the opposite, that the DNA evidence proved Collins was even more dangerous and depraved than initially believed. Someone who had assaulted a pregnant woman, fathered a child through that assault, and then murdered that child 7 years later along with his half-sister. The evidence, Silva believed, didn't humanize Collins. It revealed him as a monster whose capacity for calculated cruelty extended across years and whose crimes formed a pattern of violence that could only be answered with the death penalty. The stage was set for a trial that would expose not just the November 12th murders, but a web of crimes stretching back years, devastating a family multiple times, and revealing depths of evil that would shock even those who thought they understood the case. Jury selection for Oregon versus Collins began on June 3, 2024, in a Multnomah County courtroom that had been equipped with additional security measures, metal detectors, armed deputies, and a glass partition separating the gallery from the well of the court. Judge Elizabeth Harmon had granted a request to sequester the jury once selected, recognizing that media coverage of the trial would be intense and potentially prejudicial. Virtually every person in Portland knew about the church shooting. The question was whether they could find 12 people who could set aside what they knew, focus only on the evidence presented in court, and render a fair verdict based on the law. Prosecutor Diana Silva and defense attorney Nathan Cross faced the daunting task of selecting jurors from a pool of 120 potential candidates, nearly all of whom had extensive exposure to pretrial publicity. Judge Harmon conducted individual voir dire, questioning each potential juror privately about their knowledge of the case, their views on the death penalty, and their ability to be fair despite the emotionally charged nature of the charges. The prosecution sought jurors who could impose the death penalty despite any personal reservations, focusing on individuals who understood that the law provided for capital punishment in cases involving the murder of children. Silva used her peremptory challenges, the limited number of juror strikes she could make without providing a reason, to eliminate potential jurors who expressed blanket opposition to execution or who seemed overly sympathetic to mental illness defenses. She was looking for people who could separate sympathy from judgment, who could acknowledge that Collins had been subjected to terrible abuse by his father while still holding him fully accountable for his choices. The defense, conversely, sought jurors who could consider mercy even in the face of horrific crimes. Individuals who believed in rehabilitation, who had personal experience with mental illness, or who harbored religious objections to state-sanctioned execution. Cross used his challenges to eliminate potential jurors who had lost children, who belonged to churches targeted by violence, or who demonstrated such visceral anger about the crime that they clearly couldn't be impartial. After 4 days of voir dire, both sides had exhausted their challenges and a jury was seated, 7 women and 5 men, ranging in age from 24 to 68, representing a cross-section of Portland's diverse population. The jury included a software engineer, a retired teacher, a barista, a nurse, a small business owner, an accountant, a social worker, a construction worker, a librarian, a graphic designer, a restaurant manager, and a graduate student. Judge Harmon administered the oath on June 7th, and the jurors were informed they would be sequestered in a hotel for the duration of the trial, prohibited from watching news coverage or discussing the case with anyone outside the jury room. The weight of their responsibility was visible in their faces as they took their seats in the jury box. These 12 ordinary citizens would decide whether Gideon Collins lived or died, and that decision would define not just his fate, but how society responded to the intersection of religious extremism, family dysfunction, and calculated violence against children. Opening statements began on June 10th with Prosecutor Silva standing before the jury and describing the events of November 12, 2023, in stark, unflinching detail. She didn't start with legal theories or abstract principles. She started with that Sunday morning, with families gathering for worship, with children's voices raised in him. She walked the jury through the opening moments of the service. Reverend Chen preparing to lead the congregation, the Whitmore family in their usual spot in the third row, Allara tracing patterns on her hymnal, Thaddeus whispering questions about dinosaurs. Silva wanted the jury to see these children as real people with personalities and futures, not just victims in a case file. Then she described the moment when Gideon Collins stood and raised his weapon. The crack of gunfire that people initially mistook for something falling. The terror that erupted as congregants realized what was happening. and the final moments of Allara and Thaddeus Whitmore's lives. Silva showed the jury photographs of the children, Allara's gap-toothed smile, Thaddeus's mop of dark curls. She asked them to remember these were not abstractions, but real children whose futures were stolen. Silva outlined the evidence that would prove Collins's guilt beyond any doubt. The fingerprint matching Collins's right index finger on the shell casing, the confession video in which Collins explained his actions in his own words, the 47-page manifesto outlining his ideology and targeting of Grace Community Church, and the eyewitness testimony from Reverend Chun and other congregants. She explained the unusual ammunition, hand-loaded rounds with specialized primers that would be traced directly to components purchased by Silas Voss and loaded in the basement workshop where both father and son's fingerprints were found. Silva concluded her opening by telling the jury that their duty was to hold Collins accountable for a crime so heinous that only the ultimate punishment could serve justice. This wasn't about vengeance, she said. It was about recognizing that some acts are so depraved, so calculated, so destructive that the death penalty is the only proportionate response society can offer. Defense attorney Nathan Cross approached his opening statement with a different strategy, acknowledging from the outset that Gideon Collins had killed Allara and Thaddeus Whitmore. There was no point denying the obvious. The evidence was overwhelming. But Cross argued that the question before the jury was not guilt, but the degree of moral culpability. He described Collins's childhood under Silas Voss's abusive indoctrination, painting a picture of a young man who had been psychologically tortured and molded into a weapon by a father who was the true architect of the November 12th attack. Cross spoke about the manifesto not as evidence of Collins's evil, but as a window into a profoundly disturbed mind that had been warped by years of religious extremism. He acknowledged that Collins was legally sane. The psychiatric evaluation had confirmed that, but argued that sanity was not the same as moral responsibility. A life sentence without parole would serve justice, Cross contended, while recognizing the mitigating factors of abuse and mental illness. He asked the jury to remember that the death penalty should be reserved for the worst of the worst, and that Collins, for all his crimes, was more victim than villain in a tragedy orchestrated by his father. The prosecution's case began with testimony from first responders who had arrived at Grace Community Church on November 12th, their accounts bringing the horror of that morning into the courtroom with visceral immediacy. Officer Sarah Brennan described entering the sanctuary to find blood splattered across a painting of Jesus blessing children that hung near the altar, hymnals scattered across the floor, and two small bodies in the third row. Her voice broke as she recounted attempting to check Thaddeus for a pulse even though it was obvious he was beyond help, training overriding the human impulse to look away from unbearable tragedy. Officer Tim Rodriguez testified about securing the scene and collecting initial witness statements, describing the chaos of congregants who had fled outside and were calling loved ones, crying, praying, and screaming questions that had no answers. The jury sat in rapt attention, several members visibly emotional as the first responders' testimony transformed the clinical facts of the case into a human nightmare that had unfolded in their own city just 7 months earlier. Detective Marcus Kelly took the stand on June 12th, walking the jury through the investigation from the initial crime scene processing to the arrest of Gideon Collins. Kelly was an experienced witness who knew how to communicate complex investigative work in terms ordinary people could understand. He described the discovery of the shell casings, the unusual nature of the ammunition, and the ATF trace that led investigators to the Voss residence within hours of the shooting. He explained the significance of the partial fingerprint on the casing wedged beneath the hymnal rack, testifying that the print matched Collins's right index finger with 14 points of comparison, well above the 12-point standard required for absolute identification. Under cross-examination, Nathan Cross tried to suggest that the print could have been transferred to the casing through innocent contact, but Kelly calmly explained that the location and pressure of the print indicated it had been made during the crimping process when the bullet was seated into the casing. The print showed significant force, consistent with gripping the brass while performing the mechanical operation of ammunition loading. Cross attempted to shake Kelly's testimony about the tooth marks on the brass, suggesting they were too minor to be definitive, but Kelly noted that Collins's former roommate had independently confirmed the unusual habit of holding bullets between his teeth before being shown the physical evidence. The testimony of Aaron Pritchard, Collins's former roommate, provided crucial corroboration. Pritchard described living with Collins for 6 months in 2022, during which Collins had set up a small reloading operation in their shared apartment. Pritchard had watched Collins work with ammunition components dozens of times and had specifically noticed the bizarre habit of holding bullets between his teeth while crimping them into casings, a technique Collins claimed gave him better tactile control over the process. When shown photographs of the tooth-marked casing from the crime scene, Pritchard confirmed that the marks were consistent with what he had observed. Under cross-examination, Cross tried to impeach Pritchard by suggesting he had a financial motive to testify, given that he had sold his story to a true crime podcast for $5,000. But Pritchard maintained that his testimony was truthful and that he had been horrified to realize his former roommate had used skills learned in their apartment to commit mass murder. The emotional center of the first week of trial came on June 14th, when Reverend Michael Chun took the stand to describe the shooting from his perspective as the youth minister leading the service. Chin recounted the peaceful atmosphere before the attack, children's voices raised in song, sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows, the sense of community and safety that made Grace Community Church feel like home to so many families. He described seeing the young man in the back corner, a face he would never forget, and the moment when that man stood and raised a gun. Chin testified that his first instinct was to shield the children nearest him, throwing his body over 3 kids in the front row and hearing the gunshots echo through the sanctuary like thunderclaps. He described the screams, the smell of gunpowder, the terrible silence that fell after the shooter left. When asked to identify the shooter in the courtroom, Chin pointed directly at Gideon Collins, his hand shaking but his voice steady as he said, "That man destroyed our congregation and killed 2 beautiful children." Cross's cross-examination of Chun was brief and respectful. He wasn't about to alienate the jury by appearing to attack a sympathetic witness who had literally used his body to shield children from bullets. Cross focused only on establishing that the shooting had happened quickly and that Chun had not observed Collins for an extended period before the attack, details that might be relevant to questions about Collins's state of mind, but that didn't challenge the core facts of Chin's testimony. Cross concluded by expressing condolences for Chin's trauma, a gesture the jury seemed to appreciate. But the damage to the defense had been done. Chin's testimony had brought the jury into the sanctuary and made them witnesses to the horror, creating an emotional context that would color their reception of all subsequent evidence. As Chun left the stand, several jurors were crying, and Judge Harmon called a 15-minute recess to allow everyone to compose themselves. The second week of trial focused on the forensic evidence that definitively linked Gideon Collins to the murder weapon and ammunition. Dr. Yolanda Grant took the stand on June 17th and methodically walked the jury through her findings, using detailed photographs and diagrams to explain how she had documented every item in the sanctuary. She showed how blood spatter patterns told the story of how bullets traveled, the positions of bodies before they were moved by paramedics, the scattered hymnals and children's drawings that had fluttered to the floor like autumn leaves. The 3 casings recovered from the scene were hand-loaded .223 Remington rounds. Unusual, because most shooters used factory ammunition rather than going through the labor-intensive process of loading their own. The distinctive potassium chlorate primer compound in these rounds was even more unusual, found almost exclusively in specialized applications or antique ammunition. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to create these specific rounds, and that someone left their fingerprints and even dental impressions on the brass. Dr. Grant's testimony about the partial fingerprint on the 3rd casing was the centerpiece of the forensic case. She displayed enlarged photographs showing the ridge patterns visible on the brass, explaining that the print had been left when someone gripped the casing with considerable force during the loading process. The print had been enhanced using cyanoacrylate fuming, the same super glue technique used in countless criminal cases, and photographed under multiple wavelengths of light to capture maximum detail. Dr. Grant testified that the print contained 14 minutiae points, specific ridge characteristics like bifurcations and endings that matched the exemplar print taken from Gideon Collins's right index finger. She explained that the FBI standard for fingerprint identification required 12 matching minutiae with no unexplained differences, meaning this print exceeded the threshold for absolute identification. Cross's cross-examination challenged the subjectivity of fingerprint analysis, a standard defense tactic in cases relying on this type of evidence. But Dr. Grant calmly noted that 3 independent examiners had all reached the same conclusion, making the likelihood of error statistically negligible. The testimony of Dr. Robert Mendez, a forensic odontologist, provided additional evidence linking Collins to the ammunition. Dr. Mendez had examined the tooth marks on the brass casing and compared them to dental impressions taken from Collins after his arrest. Using side-by-side photographs and overlay techniques, Dr. Mendez demonstrated that the bite pattern on the casing matched Collins's dentition with remarkable specificity, including a distinctive gap between his upper incisors and a slightly rotated lateral incisor, unique characteristics that made the match virtually certain. Dr. Mendez testified that the pressure and angle of the bite marks indicated the casing had been held vertically between the teeth while force was applied to crimp a bullet into place, consistent with Aaron Pritchard's testimony about Collins's reloading habits. The combination of fingerprint and bite mark evidence created a dual identification that Cross could not effectively challenge. The jury's body language, leaning forward, taking notes, nodding slightly, suggested they were convinced beyond doubt that Collins had created the ammunition used in the attack. ATF Special Agent Marcus Tobias provided testimony that traced the ammunition components from manufacturer to murderer, explaining the investigative path that had led to Collins's arrest within 24 hours of the shooting. Agent Tobias described the potassium chlorate database maintained by ATF, which tracked purchases of chemicals that could be used in explosive or incendiary devices. When the primer compound from the Grace Community Church casings was analyzed, it matched a specific batch sold by a chemical supplier in Idaho to only 2 buyers in Oregon. The first buyer, eliminated immediately, had been in a hospital bed during the shooting. The second buyer had used a credit card registered to Edmund Voss, who had died in 2021, triggering a fraud alert that had been classified as low priority until the church shooting investigation began. Agent Tobias testified that the shipping address for the fraudulent purchase was the Voss family residence where Gideon Collins lived, and that subsequent investigation revealed Silas Voss had maintained his deceased father's credit card to make untraceable purchases. The ammunition component purchases were corroborated by financial records introduced through forensic accountant Lisa Chong, who had traced the flow of money from Edmund Voss's estate through various accounts controlled by Silas. Chong testified that Silas had systematically drained his father's assets over 3 years, using the funds to purchase weapons, ammunition components, and survival supplies totaling more than $45,000. The fraudulent credit card had been used for multiple purchases of materials used in ammunition manufacturing, including brass casings, bullets, gunpowder, and the potassium chlorate compound. Chang's testimony established that the ammunition creation was not a spur-of-the-moment decision, but part of a long-term pattern of preparation and planning, strengthening the prosecution's argument for premeditation. Cross's cross-examination focused on the fact that Silas, not Gideon, had made the purchases, but Chong noted that the materials had been shipped to the residence both men shared, and that the reloading equipment bore fingerprints from both father and son. The evidence painted a picture of collaboration, not just one individual acting alone while the other remained ignorant. The ballistics testimony from firearms examiner Thomas Wu provided the final link in the evidentiary chain connecting the casings recovered from the church to the murder weapon found in Silas Voss's possession. Wu explained that every firearm leaves unique marks on cartridge casings, microscopic scratches and impressions created when the firing pin strikes the primer and when the extractor pulls the spent case from the chamber. Using a comparison microscope, Wu had examined the 3 casings from the crime scene and test-fired samples from the Ruger AR-556 rifle seized from Silas's truck. The firing pin impressions, ejector marks, and breech face signatures matched perfectly, proving that the crime scene casings had been fired from that specific weapon. Wu testified that the probability of 2 different firearms producing identical marks was astronomically low, making this a definitive identification that connected Silas's rifle to the murder scene. The fact that Silas had purchased the weapon 6 months before the shooting and had been present near the church on November 12 completed the picture of a conspiracy between father and son, with Silas providing not just the ideology, but the actual tools of murder. The most dramatic moment of the forensic testimony phase came when Prosecutor Silva introduced the confession video, a 22-minute recording that would eliminate any remaining doubt about Collins's guilt and his awareness of what he was doing. The courtroom lights were dimmed, and the video played on large monitors positioned so that every juror, every spectator, and the defendant himself could see Gideon Collins sitting in his bedroom on November 11, 2023, explaining his plans for the following day. Collins spoke with chilling calm, his voice measured and steady, as if he were recording a cooking tutorial rather than a prelude to mass murder. He talked about his belief that he was carrying out God's will, his conviction that progressive Christianity was leading souls to damnation, and his decision to target Allara and Thaddeus Whitmore specifically because they were young enough to be saved through death before their parents' beliefs could corrupt them. The jury watched Collins quote scripture, passages about Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac, about Sodom and Gomorrah, about the necessity of bloodshed to awaken the faithful, twisting biblical texts into justifications for child murder. Collins described his reconnaissance of Grace Community Church in methodical detail: the layout of the sanctuary, the timing of services, the demographics of the congregation. He spoke about the Whitmore family by name, having identified them through Serafina's public Facebook page, and explained why they were ideal targets. A progressive family with young children attending a church known for LGBTQ advocacy. Then, in the video's most haunting moment, Collins thanked his father for preparing me for this mission and giving me the tools to complete God's work. When the video ended and the lights came back up, several jurors were visibly shaken. One woman in the back row was crying silently, her hand pressed against her mouth. The confession video was devastating because it showed Collins as articulate, rational, and fully aware that society would view his actions as murder. He wasn't ranting or raving or demonstrating obvious psychosis. He was calmly explaining a plan he'd developed over months, showing clear awareness of consequences while arguing that divine law superseded human law. Cross moved to strike the confession video as unduly prejudicial, arguing that it inflamed emotions without providing information beyond what was already established by other evidence. Judge Harmon denied the motion, ruling that the video was highly probative of Collins's state of mind and consciousness of guilt, and that any prejudicial effect was inherent in the nature of the crime itself. The ruling was a significant defeat for the defense because the confession video eliminated any possibility of arguing that Collins hadn't understood what he was doing or had acted on impulse. In his own words, recorded the night before the shooting, Collins had demonstrated clear planning, rational thought processes, and full awareness that society would view his actions as criminal. The legal standard for sanity, understanding the nature and wrongfulness of one's acts, had been met on camera, in Collins's own words, with no ambiguity whatsoever. The final forensic witness was Dr. Raymond Wu, the psychiatrist who had conducted the court-ordered mental health evaluation of Collins in January 2024. Dr. Wu testified that Collins suffered from delusional disorder, religious type, a condition characterized by fixed false beliefs that cannot be shaken by contrary evidence. Collins genuinely believed that God had commanded him to kill children and that doing so would trigger a spiritual awakening in the broader Christian community. However, Dr. Wu was emphatic that delusional disorder did not meet the legal standard for insanity under Oregon law, which required that the defendant either not understand the nature of his actions or not know they were wrong. Collins understood perfectly well that he was killing children and that society considered such actions to be murder. He simply believed that God's law superseded human law, a theological position, not a cognitive deficit. Dr. Wu's testimony was devastating to any potential insanity defense, and Cross's cross-examination could only establish that Collins's delusions were genuine rather than feigned, a point that might generate sympathy in the penalty phase but did nothing to negate guilt. On June 26th, Prosecutor Silva prepared to introduce the DNA bombshell that would transform public understanding of the case. She called forensic geneticist Dr. Jennifer Park from the Oregon State Crime Lab, who testified about the routine DNA analysis conducted on evidence from the crime scene. Dr. Park explained that swabs taken from Thaddeus Whitmore's clothing had yielded genetic material that was analyzed and compared against reference samples from family members and the suspect. Dr. Park's testimony became more technical as she described the DNA matching process, explaining how forensic geneticists examine specific genetic markers to determine familial relationships. The analysis had revealed that the DNA profile from Thaddeus Whitmore showed a parent-child relationship with Gideon Collins, indicated by the sharing of alleles at multiple loci in a pattern that could only occur between biological father and child. Dr. Park testified that the probability of this relationship occurring by chance was less than 1 in several billion, making it a virtual certainty that Collins was Thaddeus's biological father. The courtroom erupted in gasps and exclamations, and Judge Harmon gavelled for order as the implications rippled through the gallery. Serafina Whitmore let out a keening wail and collapsed against her husband, who sat rigid in his seat, his face drained of color. Silva carefully led Dr. Park through the implications of the DNA finding, establishing that the genetic evidence pointed to a sexual encounter between Collins and Serafina Whitmore that had occurred approximately 7 years earlier, around 2017, when Collins would have been 21 and Serafina would have been in her early 30s. Silva introduced evidence that Collins had attended several social events at Grace Community Church during that period, including a fundraiser on a night when Cormac Whitmore had been traveling for work. The DNA revelation fundamentally altered the narrative of the case, providing a potential alternative motive for the murder of Thaddeus Whitmore. If Collins had killed Thaddeus to eliminate evidence of a prior crime, that suggested a rational, self-interested motive rather than purely delusional religious mission. Cross immediately seized on this evidence in his cross-examination of Dr. Park, establishing that if Collins had killed Thaddeus to hide evidence of sexual assault, that proved Collins was capable of planning and executing crimes for personal benefit, which contradicted the prosecution's portrait of him as a religious zealot acting solely on ideological beliefs. Silva objected that the two motives were not mutually exclusive. Collins could have killed Allara for ideological reasons and Thaddeus to hide his paternity, but Cross had successfully introduced doubt about whether religious extremism was the primary driver of Collins's actions. The jury's expressions suggested confusion and horror as they processed this new information, trying to reconcile the image of an ideological terrorist with that of a sexual predator covering his tracks. Judge Harmon called a recess after Dr. Park's testimony, and the courtroom slowly emptied as spectators and media rushed to process and report the stunning revelation. Silva then called Dr. Marcus Williams, a DNA analyst who had conducted additional genetic testing to determine whether the 2017 encounter could have been consensual. Dr. Williams explained that advances in forensic toxicology had allowed testing of hair samples that Serafina had saved from Thaddeus for sentimental reasons, baby curls preserved in a memory box. The hair had preserved trace amounts of chemicals that could be detected years later. An analysis had revealed the presence of GHB metabolites, remnants of gamma-hydroxybutyric acid, a date rape drug. The metabolites in Thaddeus's hair would have been passed from mother to child if Serafina had been drugged at the time of conception. The findings suggested that Serafina had been chemically incapacitated during the encounter with Collins, transforming what might have been ambiguous circumstances into clear evidence of drug-facilitated sexual assault. The courtroom buzzed with horrified whispers as the implications sank in, and Cormac Whitmore stood abruptly and left the courtroom, unable to remain for testimony about his wife's assault. Silva used Dr. Williams's testimony to argue that the DNA evidence proved not an alternative motive, but rather an additional layer of Collins's depravity. Collins had sexually assaulted Serafina in 2017, fathered a child through that assault, and then 7 years later returned to kill that child along with his half-sister. Silva argued that the murder of Thaddeus wasn't about hiding evidence of the original crime. Too much time had passed for that to be a realistic concern, but rather about Collins's twisted attempt to erase what he viewed as his impure lineage. The manifesto's language about cleansing and purification took on new meaning in light of the DNA evidence, suggesting that Collins had targeted Thaddeus specifically because the boy was a living reminder of his own sin. Silva called Detective Kelly back to the stand to testify about evidence found on Collins's laptop during the investigation. Kelly described finding deleted search history from October 2023, just weeks before the shooting, showing that Collins had researched DNA testing services and had visited websites about proving paternity. The searches suggested Collins had suspected or discovered his relationship to Thaddeus and had been grappling with that knowledge in the weeks leading up to the attack, making it likely that the murder was influenced by his awareness of the biological connection. The guilt phase of the trial concluded on July 9th, with closing arguments from both sides. Silva stood before the jury and methodically reviewed the evidence that proved Gideon Collins's guilt beyond any reasonable doubt. The fingerprint match, the confession video, the manifesto, the eyewitness testimony, the forensic evidence linking the murder weapon to Silas Voss's conspiracy, and now the DNA evidence showing that Collins had assaulted Serafina years before murdering both her children. Silva reminded the jury that the defense had not disputed the core facts. Collins had killed Allara and Thaddeus Whitmore, but had instead asked for mercy based on his abusive upbringing and mental illness. Silva argued that mercy was a luxury the victims had not been afforded, and that Gideon Collins had shown no mercy to two innocent children when he ended their lives in the sanctuary of Grace Community Church. The emotional climax of Silva's closing came when she displayed photographs of Allara and Thaddeus on large screens flanking the jury box, asking the jurors to remember that these were not abstract victims, but real children with personalities, dreams, and futures that had been stolen. Defense attorney Nathan Cross approached his closing argument by acknowledging his client's guilt while arguing for mercy. Cross stated that Gideon Collins had indeed killed Allara and Thaddeus Whitmore, that those deaths were tragic and horrifying, and that nothing he said should minimize the Whitmore family's pain. But Cross argued that true justice required understanding the full context of how Gideon Collins had become a killer. Cross walked the jury through Gideon's childhood under Silas Voss, describing the systematic indoctrination, the isolation from normal childhood experiences, and the psychological torture that had warped Gideon's understanding of right and wrong. He argued that Gideon had never had a fair chance at a normal life, that he had been molded into a weapon by a father who bore primary moral responsibility for the November 12th attack. Cross then addressed the death penalty itself, arguing that executing Gideon would not bring back Allara and Thaddeus and would not heal the Whitmore family's wounds. He pointed out that Gideon was 28 years old, meaning he could spend the next 50 or 60 years in prison thinking about what he had done, grappling with his guilt, and potentially finding redemption. The jury deliberated for 14 hours over 2 days before reaching a verdict on the guilt phase. At 4 p.m. on July 10th, Judge Harmon was notified that a verdict had been reached, and the courtroom filled quickly as words spread through the courthouse. Gideon Collins was brought from the holding cell to the defense table, his expression unchanged from the blank serenity he had maintained throughout the trial. Serafina Whitmore sat in the front row of the gallery, her hands clasped in her lap, while supporters from Grace Community Church filled the seats behind her. Judge Harmon brought the jury into the courtroom and asked the foreperson, juror number 3, a retired teacher named Martha Richardson, whether they had reached a verdict. Richardson stood and confirmed they had reached unanimous verdicts on all counts. The clerk read, "In the case of Oregon versus Collins, count 1, aggravated murder of Allara Whitmore, we the jury find the defendant Gideon Collins guilty." Serafina gasped and began to cry as the clerk continued through all counts, returning guilty verdicts on each: 2 counts of aggravated murder, burglary, weapons violations, and terrorism. The penalty phase began immediately, with both sides presenting additional evidence about whether Collins should be sentenced to death or life without parole. Silva called witnesses to testify about the impact of the murders on the Grace Community Church congregation and the broader Portland community, painting a picture of lives destroyed and innocence shattered. The most powerful testimony came from Reverend Michael Chun, who described the church's struggle to rebuild after November 12th. The congregants who had left because they could no longer feel safe in the sanctuary, the children who still had nightmares about the shooting months later. Chun testified that the church had considered closing entirely, but had ultimately decided to remain open as an act of defiance against those who would use violence to silence progressive faith communities. Cross presented mitigation witnesses, including Dr. Sarah Jensen, who reiterated her testimony about the psychological effects of Silas's abuse, and a social worker who had briefly worked with the Voss family in 2015 and had noted concerns about the household environment that were never adequately investigated by Child Protective Services. The victim impact statement from Serafina Whitmore was scheduled for July 15th, and the courtroom was packed as she took the stand to address Collins directly. Serafina had written a 10-page statement describing her children's lives, the trauma of losing them, and the additional horror of learning about Thaddeus's conception through sexual assault. She spoke for 45 minutes, her voice breaking repeatedly as she described Allara's last moments, the sound of gunshots echoing through the church, and the weight of Thaddeus's lifeless body in her arms. Serafina addressed Collins directly, asking him how a loving God could command the murder of children. When Collins opened his mouth as if to respond, his attorney placed a hand on his arm to silence him. Serafina concluded by stating that she wanted Collins to receive the death penalty not because it would heal her wounds, nothing could, but because it was the only punishment that approached the enormity of what he had taken from her family. Midway through Serafina's victim impact statement, as she described learning that Thaddeus was Collins's biological son, Whitmore suffered a second massive heart attack in his hospital bed at Providence Portland Medical Center. Doctors attempted resuscitation for 47 minutes, but were unable to save him, and Cormac was pronounced dead at 2:43 p.m. on July 15, 2024. The news reached the courtroom within minutes, and Judge Harmon called a recess to inform Serafina of her husband's death in chambers. Serafina's screams could be heard through the closed door, a sound of grief so raw and primal that it silenced the murmuring courtroom and left even hardened court personnel shaken. When the trial resumed on July 16th, Silva announced Cormac's death on the record and requested that it be considered as an additional impact of Collins's crimes. Cross objected that Collins could not be held responsible for a heart attack that occurred months after the shooting, but Judge Harmon ruled that the jury could consider the totality of consequences flowing from the murders, including the destruction of the Whitmore family unit. The jury deliberated on the penalty phase for 2 days before reaching a unanimous decision on July 18, 2024. They found that the aggravating factors, the deliberate targeting of children, the violation of a house of worship, the premeditated nature of the crime, and the additional context of sexual assault, substantially outweighed the mitigating factors of Collins's abusive upbringing and mental illness. The jury recommended a sentence of death by lethal injection. Judge Harmon scheduled formal sentencing for September 14, 2024, and Collins was returned to the Oregon State Penitentiary to await execution, while Silas Voss awaited his own trial on conspiracy charges. The Whitmore family, now reduced to Serafina alone, began the impossible task of planning Cormac's funeral while still grieving for their children. The case had claimed another victim, and the toll of violence extended far beyond the bodies counted on November 12. The formal sentencing hearing on September 14, 2024, was brief and procedural, but the weight of the moment was palpable in the Multnomah County courtroom. Judge Elizabeth Harmon recited the jury's findings with the measured formality that such occasions demand, noting that the aggravating factors in this case substantially outweighed any mitigating circumstances. She detailed the deliberate targeting of children in a place of worship, the months of premeditation evident in the manifesto and planning documents, the sexual assault that preceded the murders by 7 years, and the calculated cruelty of a man who had drugged and assaulted a woman, fathered a child through that assault, and then returned to murder both that child and his half-sister. Judge Harmon stated that the crimes committed by Gideon Collins represented a level of depravity that demanded society's strongest response. She imposed the sentence of death as required by law, setting no specific execution date, but ordering Collins to be held at the Oregon State Penitentiary pending the automatic appeals process that accompanies every death sentence. Collins was given an opportunity to make a statement before sentencing, and he surprised the courtroom by standing and addressing Serafina directly for the first time since the trial began. In a calm, measured voice that showed no emotion or remorse, he said, "I am sorry for the pain I have caused you, but I am not sorry for what I did. I saved 2 souls from corruption, and I would do it again if God commanded." The statement eliminated any lingering possibility of clemency or successful appeal based on remorse or rehabilitation. Collins had just told the world, on the record, that he remained committed to his ideology and would murder children again if he believed it served his religious mission. Serafina's response was visceral and immediate. She stood from her seat in the gallery and spit in Collins's direction before being gently led from the courtroom by victim advocates who had been supporting her throughout the ordeal. Judge Harmon concluded by stating that Collins would be executed by lethal injection at a date to be determined by the Oregon Department of Corrections, pending the exhaustion of all appeals, a process that typically takes years or even decades in capital cases. As Collins was led from the courtroom for the final time, his wrists and ankles shackled, his orange jumpsuit marking him as condemned, Serafina Whitmore stood on the courthouse steps and addressed the assembled media. Television cameras from local and national outlets captured her statement, broadcasting it across the country to millions of viewers who had followed the trial with horrified fascination. Serafina spoke about Allara's love of animals and her dream of becoming a veterinarian, about Thaddeus's endless curiosity and his questions about dinosaurs and why the sky was blue. She described Cormac's dedication to their family and the heart attack that had claimed his life during the trial, a death she attributed directly to the stress and trauma of losing his children and learning the truth about Thaddeus's conception. Serafina stated that while the death sentence could not bring her family back, it provided a measure of closure knowing that Gideon Collins would face the ultimate consequence for destroying her world. She thanked the jury for their service, prosecutor Diana Silva for her tireless advocacy, and the Portland community for their support during the darkest period of her life. Then Serafina said something that would resonate in the ongoing debate about the death penalty and its role in American justice. She acknowledged that Oregon had not executed anyone since 1997, that the current governor had placed a moratorium on executions, and that Collins would likely spend decades on death row before any sentence was carried out, if it ever was. But she argued that the symbolic value of the death sentence mattered, that it sent a message about how society valued the lives of children and the sanctity of places of worship. Whether Gideon Collins dies by lethal injection or dies of old age in prison, Serafina said, "What matters is that 12 citizens looked at the evidence, heard what he did to my family, and decided that his crimes deserved death. That judgment matters. That condemnation matters. And I hope it provides some small measure of deterrence to anyone else who thinks religious extremism justifies violence against innocents." She turned and walked away from the cameras, disappearing into a black sedan that would take her to an uncertain future haunted by memories and what-ifs. The case of Oregon versus Collins would continue to reverberate through the legal system for years as Collins's attorneys filed the mandatory appeals that accompany every death sentence in America. The appeals process would challenge various aspects of the trial: the admissibility of the confession video, the sufficiency of the mental health evaluation, the prejudicial impact of the DNA evidence, and the adequacy of Collins's legal representation. Each appeal would be reviewed by higher courts, with prosecutors defending the conviction and sentence at every stage. Legal experts predicted that the appeals process would take at least 10 to 15 years, possibly longer, before all state and federal remedies were exhausted. During that time, Collins would remain on death row at the Oregon State Penitentiary, isolated from the general prison population in a single cell unit designed for condemned inmates. He would have limited contact with other prisoners, restricted access to visitors, and hours of solitary confinement that mental health experts argue constitutes its own form of cruel and unusual punishment. The separate trial of Silas Voss began in March 2025, nearly a year and a half after the church shooting, and provided additional details about the conspiracy that had led to the murders. Silas was charged with conspiracy to commit murder, accessory to murder, evidence tampering, and fraud related to the credit card scheme involving his deceased father's financial accounts. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence of Silas's role in radicalizing Gideon, providing the weapons and ammunition used in the attack, conducting reconnaissance of Grace Community Church, and driving his son to the scene on November 12th. The G's mission, planning documents, the ammunition components purchased with fraudulent credit cards, the cell phone records placing Silas near the church at the time of the shooting, and the surveillance footage showing Silas's truck dropping off a figure matching Gideon's description all painted an irrefutable picture of active conspiracy. Silas's defense team attempted to argue that he had been trying to manage his son's mental illness and had not known that Gideon intended to commit murder, but the evidence contradicted every aspect of that narrative. The jury in Silas Voss's trial deliberated for just 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Because the death penalty was not available for conspiracy and accessory charges, only for those who actually committed the murders, Silas was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Judge Harmon, who also presided over Silas's trial, stated during sentencing that while Silas had not pulled the trigger, he was equally culpable for the deaths of Allara and Thaddeus Whitmore. She described Silas as the architect of a multi-generational conspiracy who had spent decades molding his son into a weapon and then unleashed that weapon on innocent children. Silas showed no remorse during sentencing, instead delivering a rambling statement about persecution of true Christians and the necessity of violent resistance against progressive ideology. His statement confirmed what prosecutors had argued throughout the trial, that Silas remained committed to the extremist beliefs that had motivated the attack and represented a continuing danger to society. He was transported to the Oregon State Penitentiary to begin serving his life sentence, housed in a different unit from his son to prevent any coordination of appeals or communication that might undermine the convictions. Grace Community Church in Portland, Oregon, struggled in the aftermath of the shooting and the highly publicized trials. Attendance declined dramatically as members moved away or found new congregations where they felt safe from the threat of violence. The sanctuary where Allara and Thaddeus had been murdered became a place of trauma rather than worship for many congregants. And despite efforts to renovate and reconsecrate the space, the memories were too powerful to overcome. Reverend Michael Chun resigned from the ministry in the summer of 2025, stating in his farewell sermon that he could no longer reconcile his faith with a God who allowed such evil to flourish. Chun's departure was a significant loss for the congregation, as he had been a beloved figure whose actions on November 12th, throwing himself over children to shield them from bullets, had saved lives. But the psychological toll of the shooting and the subsequent trial had left Chun with severe PTSD and a crisis of faith that made continuing in ministry impossible. The church leadership considered closing Grace Community permanently, selling the building and disbanding the congregation. But a core group of members argued that closing would constitute a victory for those who used violence to silence progressive voices, and that the church had a moral obligation to remain open as an act of defiance and resilience. In October 2025, the congregation voted narrowly to remain open, hiring a new minister and implementing extensive security measures, including armed security guards, metal detectors, and a comprehensive threat assessment protocol. Attendance remained far below pre-shooting levels, and the church operated at a significant financial deficit, relying on donations from supporters across the country who saw Grace Community as a symbol of resistance against religious extremism. The third-row pew where the Whitmore family had sat was removed and replaced with a memorial installation featuring photographs of Allara and Thaddeus, along with a plaque reading, "In memory of innocence stolen. May their light inspire us to choose love over hate." Serafina Whitmore lived on, though lived, hardly captured the reality of her existence in the years following the murders and her husband's death. She moved out of the family home in Portland, unable to bear the memories contained in every room, and relocated to a small apartment in a different neighborhood where she had no history. Serafina struggled with severe depression, PTSD, and what her therapist called complicated grief, mourning not just the loss of her children and husband, but also processing the trauma of learning about the sexual assault and Thaddeus's true paternity. She attended therapy multiple times per week and participated in support groups for families of crime victims, though she often found that other participants couldn't comprehend the specific layers of horror in her experience. How do you explain to someone that the man who murdered your children had also drugged and raped you 7 years earlier? How do you process that one of those murdered children was conceived through that assault? The psychological burden was almost incomprehensible. Serafina became an advocate for victims' rights and stronger laws against religious extremism and domestic terrorism. She testified before the Oregon State Legislature in support of bills that would enhance penalties for hate crimes targeting houses of worship and that would improve reporting and intervention protocols when individuals displayed warning signs of radicalization. She gave interviews to media outlets, always careful to focus on policy changes rather than dwelling on the specific details of her personal tragedy, though the personal was always present in her testimony. "My children are gone," she would say. "My husband is gone. I can't change that. But maybe I can help prevent another family from experiencing what mine did. Maybe I can help identify warning signs before someone like Gideon Collins acts. Maybe some good can come from this nightmare." Her advocacy work provided some sense of purpose, but those close to Serafina knew that she was simply going through the motions of living. that her spirit had died on November 12, 2023, even if her body continued to function. The case raised broader questions about religious extremism in America and the mechanisms available to prevent radicalized individuals from committing violence. Mental health experts pointed to Gideon Collins as a case study in how childhood trauma and systematic indoctrination can create domestic terrorists. Silas Voss's decades-long abuse of his son, the isolation from mainstream society, and the constant reinforcement of violent ideology had created exactly the kind of vulnerable individual that extremist movements exploit. But experts also noted that Collins had been exposed to alternative viewpoints during his time at Mount Angel Seminary, had been offered counseling and intervention by faculty concerned about his increasingly extreme beliefs, and had repeatedly chosen to reject those opportunities in favor of doubling down on his father's ideology. The case illustrated the tension between understanding radicalization as a process and recognizing that individuals retain moral agency and choice even when subjected to extraordinary psychological pressure. The survivalist communities in Eastern Oregon where Silas Voss had found refuge after the shooting faced increased scrutiny from law enforcement in the aftermath of the trials. Federal and state agencies conducted investigations into whether these communities were actively harboring extremists or facilitating violence, though prosecutions were complicated by First Amendment protections for religious expression and Second Amendment protections for gun ownership. Civil liberties advocates warned against broad crackdowns that would infringe on constitutional rights, while victims' advocates argued that some forms of extremist ideology, particularly when coupled with stockpiling weapons and conducting tactical training, crossed the line from protected speech into criminal conspiracy. The debate reflected broader tensions in American society about how to balance security with liberty and how to identify genuine threats without engaging in religious or ideological persecution. As of late 2025, Gideon Collins remained on death row at the Oregon State Penitentiary, his appeals working their way through the court system at the glacial pace typical of capital cases. Legal observers predicted that his execution, if it ever occurred, was years or even decades away. Oregon's de facto moratorium on executions, established by Governor Tina Kotek in 2023, meant that no execution date would be set regardless of how Collins's appeals proceeded. The moratorium was a source of frustration for some victims' rights advocates who argued that death sentences should be carried out rather than becoming life sentences by another name. But opponents of capital punishment pointed out that the lengthy appeals process had exonerated numerous death row inmates over the years, proving that even seemingly airtight cases sometimes convicted innocent people. In Collins's case, the evidence was overwhelming and the confession explicit, but the broader debate about the death penalty's role in American justice continued unresolved. Silas Voss, serving life without parole, became something of a figure in white supremacist and Christian extremist circles, with his letters from prison circulated on fringe websites and his case cited as an example of government persecution of true believers. Prison officials monitored his correspondence carefully and restricted his ability to communicate with outside extremist groups, but Silas managed to maintain some level of contact with sympathizers who viewed him as a martyr for their cause. The fact that Silas remained unrepentant and continued to advocate for violence in the name of religious purity underscored the challenge of rehabilitation in cases of ideological extremism. Unlike criminals motivated by greed, passion, or mental illness, ideological extremists often remain committed to their beliefs despite imprisonment, making them ongoing threats even when physically confined. The story of Gideon Collins, Silas Voss, and the Whitmore family would be studied in criminal psychology courses, law schools, and theology seminars for years to come as a case that illuminated the darkest intersections of family dysfunction, religious extremism, and calculated violence. It raised questions about how society identifies and intervenes with at-risk individuals before they commit atrocities, about the limits of mental health defenses in cases where defendants are technically sane but operating under delusional beliefs, and about whether the death penalty serves any purpose beyond symbolic condemnation when executions are rarely carried out. The case challenged comfortable assumptions about the nature of evil. Collins was not a monster born that way, but rather a human being who had been systematically warped by his father's ideology and who had made a series of choices that led inexorably to murder. And at the center of it all remained Serafina Whitmore, a woman who had lost everything and who carried the unbearable burden of being the sole survivor of a family destroyed by violence. She continued to wake up each morning, to attend therapy, to advocate for policy changes, to go through the motions of living even when life felt meaningless. Friends who saw her on the anniversary of the shooting, or on what would have been Allara's birthday, or on what would have been Thaddeus's first day of school, recognized the profound emptiness in her eyes. The look of someone who had seen too much, suffered too much, and endured too much. Justice, when it finally came in the form of death sentences and life imprisonment for the Collins men, brought no peace to Serafina Whitmore. It brought only the cold satisfaction of seeing evil condemned and the hollow knowledge that condemnation could not undo what had been done. She lived on, carrying her grief like a physical weight, a testament to the enduring human capacity to survive even when survival feels like its own form of punishment. The case of Oregon versus Collins would be remembered as one of the most disturbing criminal trials in recent American history, not just for the brutality of the crimes, but for the layers of horror that kept emerging, each revelation worse than the last, each truth more painful than anyone could have imagined.